Hey there, I'm Ken. This is Canadian Retro Things, and it is time for part one of the Robert Kilgus interview. So it looks like this interview is going to be broken up into 4 parts. This is part one. This will be the early years. This is going to be before he started doing any work for Radio Shack. So let's jump right into that interview. Hey there, this is Ken. This is Canadian Retro Things, and today I'm in Flint, Michigan doing an interview. I'm sitting down today with L Curtis Boyle and Bob Kilgus. You may recognize the name from some great CoCo games of the past, such as Dino Wars and Skiing, but because this is going to be a in-depth interview and I want to make sure everything goes perfectly, I'm not going to be sitting here. Curtis is going to be doing the interview, and I am going to be behind the camera.
Okay, well, welcome to the show, Bob, and then thanks for agreeing to the interview, and thank you for all the great software you've done. It's not just games; you've done a lot of other stuff. We'll get into that. But first, I want to get a start of your computer history. So, you were into the computer industry like very early on compared to most of the rest of us. And I was wondering, what is the first computer you ever used?
Well, the first computer I ever worked with, I'm not sure whether I should say it was the machines I worked on in the Army or whether it was when I got out of the Army. I had experience in the Army with electronic equipment that encoded and decoded teletype signals. They were very much like a computer, but not quite.
Sort of electromechanical combination?
No, they were electronic, but they had flip-flops that had vacuum tubes in them. And you don't see that these days, or even just a couple years later. In 1965, or in 1963, when I got out of the service, I went to work at Burroughs Corporation, and that was really the first machine that I ever got intimate with.
Yeah.
The B5000, a big monster of a machine with cabinets 5 feet tall, 4 feet wide, and just a whole room full of equipment. One entire cabinet was nothing more than the power supply for the monster. And I think you're going to find there's probably going to be a picture of one of the diodes of the bridge rectifier in that power supply that I had to replace one of the diodes, and I managed to keep it for a strange reason. And now it's a part of the club, apparently.
Yep.
And that computer, I was being trained to maintain the electronic part of it, the processor, the memory units, the input-output units, as opposed to other engineers who were responsible for the peripheral equipment.
Because these systems were so big, you needed more than one person
Oh, yeah.
to look after them.
I mean, it took a lot of time to go through all of those cabinets full of cooling fans on top and get up on a stepladder with a hypodermic needle shooting oil into those fans to keep them from squeaking and making a noise when they were running, because all the power that was being generated and going through those cabinets generated a lot of heat, and of course that meant air conditioning. Yeah. So I was spoiled on air conditioning, and after being a field engineer and working with a big computer like that for so long, air conditioning was a necessity of life to me. I had to have air conditioning in my car and at home. Just one of the side effects of working with big computers.
Now, do you know much about the history of Burroughs? Like, how long had they been around producing commercial computers before you joined?
Well, Burroughs started out early in the century with adding machines.
Okay, kind of like IBM did with the
exactly.
Yeah.
There were Burroughs adding machines, but and there were earlier versions of computers before the ones I got on. I don't know very much at all about them, but the bank that I was working at had lesser machines that were attached to the check sorters
Okay.
that would read the micro encoding on the checks and store it up and put it out on a tape, and then take the tape and give it to the big machine where it would be processed and validated and recorded in the individual accounts.
Okay. Yeah, so it's not like they had some experience with computers before you got there.
Well, they did have experience with computers, but they were all, you do one job at a time. You'd
Like special purpose.
yeah, you'd load in a bunch of checks and get them out on a tape. You'd take that tape, you'd put that into the machine, and it would sort them and put the sorted ones out on another tape or something like that. Or you generate a report, write it out onto a tape, and then later you'd take the tape and you would put it back in the machine and run it through and print out the report. And when it came to the new machine, it was capable of multiprocessing, and the operators had no idea how to utilize the power that multiprocessing would give you.
Because they just weren't used to it.
They were used to all this single thing. You've got a job. You do the job
Until it's done.
until it's done. Even if it's multiple steps, you do each step in turn until it's done. Whereas on the big computer capable of multiprocessing, I ended up showing them that you can do one job reading in check information, posting it to accounts, and outputting a tape that is going to be a report, a trial balance that shows all of the accounts and their activity. And then you go on and you take that activity and you run that tape to a printer to print out statements or something, and while you are doing that, you can put another job in that reads in the activity for different types of accounts. Bring in the activity for the Christmas club or something like that, and process that. And while that is being processed and writing out a tape with reports on it, you can be reading the tape from the previous job and printing it at the same time.
Utilizing the machine's full resources rather than just kind of wasting parts.
Right.
Yeah.
So it didn't require any changing in any programming. All it took was a change in priorities on timing of what you do when. It's like they were trying to feed an animal and just give it as much as you can without it barfing. And as opposed to, they're dealing with a monster here that has a tremendous appetite, and you can just keep feeding it more and more work, and it just keeps gobbling it up, and it just does fine. And it wasn't until they started utilizing that full capacity and feeding it what it could handle that all of a sudden they didn't need as much time for processing or as many man hours to operate the machines or have more machines or anything like that. It was there.
So how did you figure that out? Like, why did you figure it out and they didn't, that you could do real true multitasking on this machine?
Well, that was because I was a field engineer at Burroughs, and I knew all about the processor. I learned the electronics on how the thing actually functioned, and they also gave me a whole week or two on learning COBOL and another week or two to learn ALGOL. And mostly I learned a language called OSIL, O-S-I-L, Operating System Instruction Language,
Okay.
which is the equivalent of machine language, assembled machine language, symbolic machine language. And that's the language that was used for their master control program in that machine. And in order to maintain that machine, I had to be able to understand and track down when things go wrong. And in order to do that, I had to be able to perhaps single step through what the operating system was doing and to a point where I could find out where it was failing, and then track that down to find the individual instruction that isn't working properly. And then I go into the electronics and start tracking true and false levels of the electronic signals internally, and to find that, oh, here's one of their plug-in modules that it's a flip-flop and it's not flopping. And so I'd pull that out and replace that flip-flop and then get the machine back up and running. But it took a lot of knowledge of all of the internal actions, both software in the operating system and hardware in terms of the machine itself.
Yeah, and from what you've described before, even going back and forth the emails and stuff, this is something that I think really helped you shine, is that you understood both halves. You weren't just a software guy, you weren't just a hardware guy, you had a really good broad knowledge of both.
Right. And especially, I learned a lot about the operating system and things that it could do that I know other machines at the time weren't doing. Their multiprocessing, it had true virtual memory functions. And
this is like the early 1960s time frame, right?
yeah, this is after I got out of the service in 1963. I was hired by Burroughs Corporation. I got out of the service, took their aptitude tests, took the tests at IBM to see if I could become a field engineer. And the Burroughs and then I went on vacation with the family. We were going up to Houghton Lake for a couple of weeks, and apparently the results came back, and Burroughs said, they want me, they got a class starting in a week, so they called me on vacation and asked me to come back. So I left my vacation after being out of the service, or coming out of the service. I came back and got just lucky to get into a class, and they put me in with the mainframe engineers as opposed to the peripheral engineers. And they told me that I was the only one they ever hired off the street for that training, as opposed to most of the people in the class were field engineers that were working on these other machines, the more primitive machines.
Okay.
And I found that that was an advantage that I had over a lot of the other engineers, because I wasn't preordained into thinking about just one thing at a time. It was perfectly natural and to be expected that if you've got processing power available and you've got something over there in an I/O that's working at a snail's pace, why not use that processing power for something else?
Yeah, exactly.
And the whole idea of memory management and allocating memory as it's needed, and if you don't need it, let something else use it. And all of that was something that I learned from their operating system about how they manage memory, and I was able to apply that to my thinking later on with the Radio Shack computers.
Yeah. Now, one thing I want to mention, for those that don't know, if you've read Boise Pete and Bill Louis' book on the history of the CoCo, they had interviewed Bob at the time, back in 2013, and one thing that Boise mentioned in the book, and I want to get into a little bit here too, is that you got interested in electronics, like that kind of led you on this path very early on. You were like taking apart stuff at home, and I was wondering what do you think triggered your love of electronics as a kid, and was there any specific incidents that happened that really said this is what I got to do for the rest of my life?
Well, in general, I was always asking questions. When I confronted something new, I didn't just want to know what it does. I want to know how it does it. So my mother's washing machine broke down. I know what a washing machine is. I know what it's supposed to do, but I didn't know how it did it. So I crawled in underneath her washing machine that had left her clothes full of water there and couldn't drain.
How old were you at this point?
I was about 9.
Okay.
And I got the back off the machine and looked underneath, and I found out that there was a solenoid that had a piece of wire connected to the water pump. And when that solenoid actuated, it would pull the pump so that an idler roller on it would go up against a drive belt on the motor that was continuously running. So in order to drain the water, you have to pull the pump over to engage that friction. And I saw the wire was missing, but I figured out that that's what must have happened because I saw the solenoid there. So I got a coat hanger and a pair of pliers, and I cut and bent a piece of wire and hooked it up in there, and lo and behold, the washing machine drained, and she was back in business, and it kept working for years after. And from that point on, my mom sort of gave me a little bit longer leash on what she let me tear apart.
Well, how much money did they save with that?
Oh,
Their 9-year-old genius.
yeah, this was back in the early 50s.
Yeah. I just find that fascinating. Like you obviously had a knack for it and a logical thinking, even at age 9, to figure out how stuff works just from looking at it and kind of tracing it by eye. Because you didn't have schematics or a manual or anything like that. I'm pretty sure, right?
Right.
Yeah. So yeah.
Nope.
Now, one other thing you mentioned, I think, too, at that time, was that when you got out of the service, you actually got offered jobs at both IBM and Burroughs, and you had decided to go with Burroughs. One was because they called you and said, "Can you come off holidays?" But they actually were offering you more pay, weren't they?
Burroughs was paying, let's see, I think IBM was offering $78 a week, and Burroughs was offering $92. That's enough.
Yeah, that's a pretty big difference.
That's a big enough difference. I'll go with the one that's willing to pay more, especially if they're that anxious to get me.
Yeah. Were the job descriptions between the two fairly the same? Like, would you have been doing roughly the same thing at both, or were they different?
It would have been essentially the same thing. A computer repairman, somebody who maintains mainframe computers, regardless, not knowing anything at that point, the extent of what the machines were capable of. Even in high school, I wrote a term paper about computers and their effect on society, and I was aware of computers and the kinds of things they could do, and just in general, I understood about the concept of the holograph, or the code of punched holes.
Yeah, for the punch cards and
punch cards, holograph or something like that. I can't remember.
Telio?
Holorant.
Okay.
Something like that.
Yeah. So obviously you had a predilection for electronics early on, and then you took some courses about relay electronics and the services you mentioned, and then you got kind of involved. Now, the software side, did you just kind of stumble into that by kind of learning how the hardware worked and you needed software to test it, or how did you get into the software side of things? What made you decide to pursue that as well?
They did teach me just enough about COBOL that I could read it and understand how it was working. And as a computer operator at the bank, I saw their programmers showing up, putting in the deck of cards for a program, running it through the compiler, and getting a printout that showed syntax errors. And they'd stare at the printer and look at that listing and say, "What the hell does that mean?" And, well, I went over and I looked over their shoulder. "What are you talking about?" "Oh." They'd say, "What does that mean?" And I said, "Well, that means such and such." I mean, it's pretty obvious. You've got a word there that isn't spelled right, something like that. They didn't understand the problem. And I started working with the programmers and helping them debug their syntax, at least, on their programs, and just talking in general about the kinds of things they were doing. And I found that I was pretty well in tune with programming and understood what it was doing. And it was a challenge. I liked challenges. And it wasn't but about 9 months after I was hired as an operator that I trained my replacement, who would teach the other operators how to take advantage of the machine's capabilities. And they allowed me to transfer into their programming department as not a trainee, but a middle grade programmer, and not a senior programmer. But within a year or so, I was the highest grade programmer in the department.
Now, did you want to pursue programming fully at that point, or did you still like doing electronic stuff? You kind of still want to do both? Or?
No, it was almost exclusively at that point. It was programming because, well, how many times can you put oil in a fan,
or replace vacuum tubes,
or replace a diode or something like that? programming is something that requires more thought, more planning, more thinking, more figuring things out.
And as you did with the dishwasher or the washing machine when you were 9, you kind of had that natural knack to do that kind of
Right.
logical thinking, how things work.
And as a programmer analyst, there was always the analyst part, which I always thought of a computer analyst as being a professional learner, because in order to computerize something, you really have to understand the jobs that you are replacing better than they know them themselves in order to be very effective at programming. So,
Yeah. So you rose to the ranks of programming like quite quickly.
yes, very quickly.
So how long did you end up working at Burroughs?
I worked at Burroughs for only about a year and a half.
And then what happened?
At that time, excuse me. At that time, the bank was desperate because they were running behind on everything, and they offered me a 20% raise over what I was making at Burroughs
Oh, wow.
to go to work for them as a computer operator, because they figured that I could get more work done. I promised them that they'll get more work done. And on the first day or first week that I went to work there, it was Wednesday afternoon that I went to my boss. They were running 12 days behind schedule on some applications and at least a couple days on, I mean, the bank can't very well open when they haven't got their checks processed from the night before, and they were running 2 days late on important applications like that. And after 3 days, I asked him, what do you want me to do with the extra 4 hours a day of computer time that's going to waste right now? Because I had all of their backlog caught up, and I created enough time that their programmers could get their time on the machine. They weren't even be able to test their programs for a while. And, well, it just made a world of difference, and enough that I got another 20% raise 3 months after that, and as I got promoted.
So did you end up becoming like a head programmer at this point? Because you were obviously more advanced than the programmers they'd hired as programmers.
Well, I became a senior programmer and then a group leader, which was the higher.
Now, was this for like a single bank branch, or was this for a whole?
Well, this was a bank that had many branches, but I was working at the main office, which is where the mainframe computer was and all the processing was done, and they had a programming staff of about 20 programmers.
And you ended up kind of running the whole show at some point, or?
Well, I wasn't the department manager. No.
Oh, okay.
I was a lead programmer, programmer analyst, and new programmers were routinely assigned to work with me, so that they could pick up tips and points, and I could help them figure things out until they got their footing in.
Okay. Did you ever officially become an instructor at the banks like you had at Burroughs then, somewhat, or did you just strictly stay as a programmer?
Well, I would not call myself an instructor so much as getting involved in a apprentice and master kind of relationship.
Oh, okay.
Like in a blacksmith, where there is the master blacksmith, but he has an apprentice working alongside of him. I was the most proficient programmer they had available, and new programmer would come in and I would show him the ropes, as it were, and help him figure out when the syntax errors came in, help him understand what it meant, how to fix it, tell him that the importance of making sure that for every if there is not only a then, but an else.
Yes, you can trap those unexpected things. So the next question I have is, how long did you work in the banking system doing this, and was it just a one bank throughout your career with that, or?
No, I worked at Bank of the Commonwealth in Detroit until 1968. And at that point, I moved to Battle Creek and started working. They hired me as a programming department manager. And it was a small private bank. And when I got there, I was not doing very well financially, and I chose a rather low-rent district place to go to move into. And I think the person who was showing me around said, oh, wait a minute, this is not the executive type of person we want that takes the other department managers home for wine tastings or things like that. I was not suited for that. So all of a sudden, the first day I showed up at work after moving, I was introduced as a programmer analyst. And here's this other guy sitting here that I never heard of or saw. This is our new programming manager. And frankly, I was happy about that because I am not the management type.
Yeah.
I was very nervous about being a department manager. And frankly, I was happy being a programmer analyst, especially with the $15,000 a year instead of $12,000 I was getting as a programmer. So as long as they're paying me the money they promised, fine, I'll be the programmer analyst. Well, it ended up that I ended up working with an accountant from one of the big rent-a-accountant places. And I was set with the task of trying to figure out why the computerized reports for their demand deposits, or excuse me, for their master charge accounts, the computerized reports didn't balance with what went through general ledger in the bank's central accounting. And they couldn't figure out what was going on. And being the systems analyst that I was, it didn't take me too long to figure out that they were not keeping proper records of their unposted or unreadable transactions that came in. You take a bunch of charge slips in, run them through the system, try to read the account numbers off of them and the amounts, and a certain number of them get kicked out as being unlegible. And you're supposed to take them to a separate group of people who then figure out what it is and either write it in or put a substitute slip in or something like that so that it could go back into the system. But they were not keeping account of how many dollars worth of stuff is being held out and how much of it, if any, is being put back in, because what you can't post has to be written off. It's a loss.
Yeah.
Well, I finally figured out that that's what the problem was, and I made some changes to their programs so that when the transactions were fed in, the unposted items would automatically be treated as if they were assigned to a unique special account in that application. Just like another person, and they get all of the junk that didn't go. And the objective was that the other clerks had to put through new transactions to reverse the transactions out
so
of
it balance again.
Take that out and put it where it belongs. But what they don't get out of there remains on the end of that file until they either figure out what to do with it or write it off. And so as long as it's in there and being shown that balance, their records balanced, the computer and the bank's master records,
general ledger.
General ledgers were in balance. And okay, so fine, I plugged the leak. Now, there is all the water on the floor that needs mopping up. And they had literally hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of potential loss sitting on the floor just waiting for somebody to mop up the mess. And so I went to work with this accountant from, it was Arthur Anderson. I had an accountant that worked with me, and we went through the stuff and keeping everything accounted for, everything in balance. I learned how to operate an adding machine pretty quickly. And we ended up getting a lot of transactions that were simply they were not meant for our bank. They needed to be put back into the system and sent back out to go to the bank they were supposed to go to. And okay, that got rid of some of it. And bit by bit, kept chewing away at it until finally I had it down to the point where the only things left that were unaccounted for that I couldn't do anything about were like $5 or $10 items that yeah, you could legitimately charge somebody for it, but they were already so many months stale that they were
Just write them off.
They would be better off writing it off than to try to put it through to accounts and have people saying, "Wait a minute, what are you doing with this? I can't possibly be right. That's from months ago." So they ended up having a very big loss, something on the neighborhood of $80,000 that they had to write off. But at the same time, they happened to have some problems in their installment loan department that I wasn't involved with, that they had a habit of rewriting loans as new loans so that they wouldn't be delinquent anymore. Anyway, they had even more that they had to write off from that, and as a result, they had to economize and get rid of 10% of their employees. And golly, wonder who they ought to get rid of. Maybe this guy over there who's making $15,000 a year, who was not really supposed to be making more than 12, and he's between jobs now. He's all done with this big job. Okay, maybe he saves us some money, but we don't need him anymore, so I got fired.
Oh, wow.
After saving them all that money. And that was the last bank I worked at. I finally went from there. This was during an economic downturn in the later 70s, and about 73, I think it was.
So the whole energy crisis when it was going on?
Yeah, with that.
Oil
And,
gas.
and I got a job at a manufacturer, Diamond Rio Truck Company in Lansing. And I worked with them on setting up accounting systems, inventory control systems, forecasting, something they call board date, where they're lining up which trucks to run through in what sequence. And they were having financial troubles, and they went bankrupt about 2 years after I started.
You just had a string of bad luck.
And yeah, I leave a trail of destruction behind me. My first marriage was a trail of destruction. My first job at the bank was partially because of the marital troubles that led me to leave the first bank that I'd been with for so long because of gossip going around.
Too much trauma.
So after Diamond Rio went bankrupt, I was unemployed for, well, it was 6 months after the bank in Battle Creek before I got the job at Diamond Rio. And when they went under, it was another 5 months before I finally got another job at a place called Motor Wheel in Lansing. And so I got a job at Motor Wheel, and I set up their, for the first time they had terminals that were connected to their computer. And they had a system called CICS that was supporting the use of terminals. And I was sent to Detroit for a 1-week course on learning CICS. And when I came back, I designed the backbone of all of their programs that were going to be interacting with the terminals. The stuff that I wrote would be part of the initial memory usage at the beginning of an application and part of the callable routines that did certain standardized functions for the rest of the terminal, including a help system where I designed a system where the programmers could, individual programmer doing a program for displaying some inventory information, they would show on their monitor screen in the department that was using it there'd be a button, a routine button that they could push for help. And it would go to a predefined routine that the programmer that wrote that application had included. One of my routines that would take that and bring up a screen of applicable help for that particular application, because the programmers would sign up for a certain screen number, and then they would compose a screen describing the text that they wanted to present when their user needed it. But all of the overhead stuff about managing which button they push, whether they want to go page forward in the help or page back or return to their normal processing, they had all kinds of stuff in, like, that became known as the Kilgus code. And all of the programs that dealt with the online inquiry systems all started out with a skeletal program that included all of the Kilgus code. And then they would add on their functions for the particular area that they're programming for. And after they went bankrupt, and I went back to visit, or before they went bankrupt, I went back to visit after working with the personal computers for a while, and I was introduced around, and a new programmer said, "What did you say your name was? Bob Kilgus? Oh, are you the guy that wrote the Kilgus code?" And I had never heard it referred to like that until that moment. But this was a couple of years after I was no longer working there.
And yet they're still using your code.
And they're still using the Kilgus code as the backbone of their inquiry programs, which was
flattering, but on the other hand, you could have been still doing that.
Yeah.
You know. So basically, you got out. I think you believe you said about around 1970s is when you kind of got out of, and we'll kind of get into the details of that. But one thing in the earlier 70s, you were kind of noticing that the microcomputer revolution was starting. We're starting to get chips from Intel and Zilog and MOS, et cetera. And a lot of them originally in the early 70s came out in kit form, but you never got one of those. So I was wondering, given your curiosity of stuff, like what made you decide that's not really for me?
Well, I did know that there was a lot more satisfaction to me with the programs that I wrote, to the point where it becomes a permanent part of a company's activities. I mean, it was gratifying, it was challenging, and rewarding. And the hardware, well, I know what the hardware is. I know how it works. I did watch with fascination as the development of integrated circuits came along, and wow, gee, now they've got 4 flip-flops on a chip. Oh, now they've got 16. Now they've got a whole couple hundred components on a chip. And I watched all of that developing. I watched the microprocessors, and I read about them, and I could see what was going on. And I noticed the chip, I would read the magazines. I used to sketch circuits about, this is how you'd put together a circuit, and here you could use a toggle switch to put inputs in, and over here you could get your output in the form of LED lights that are hooked up here. And I knew all of the circuitry that was involved, that you could do that. But frankly, I wanted a machine that was going to do something, not just function.
Yeah, because these are more like hobby kits to teach you how a computer worked, and they weren't totally all that useful.
Yeah, I mean, that's like, when I was in school, I used to go to all the shop classes. I had woodworking shop, I had metalworking shop, I had a radio shop, I had home electrical wiring shop. I wanted to know how to do everything, but not make a career of it. I just wanted to know how to do it, because then I could understand it. And when something goes wrong, I know what to look for. And it was the same thing with the hardware on the computer. Okay, I know how those things work, but frankly, I would much rather have one that I can sit on the table and do things with. And
lo and behold, in 1977, this started to happen.
Yep, here along, all of a sudden, The dream comes true. There is a machine that's all put together with everything I need. A Radio Shack, a pet, and an apple.
All right, that is part 1 of the Robert Kilgus interview. Thanks for watching. The next part will be coming out in the next couple of days. It is going to be covering the Model 1 years when he first started doing work for Radio Shack. So thanks for watching. Don't forget that a like, a subscribe, and a comment below are all things that help the channel out a lot and are greatly appreciated. But until that next part comes out, see you later.